Hello and welcome to 12 Steps to a Greener Lawn. I'm Thomas Bowles, the Agricultural Extension Agent for Prince William County. I work for Virginia Cooperative Extension. We are a part of Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. Our mission is to bring unbiased research-based information to the public. I hope you enjoy our program. So today we're going to talk about 12 best management practices for turf, and we'll go through them and hopefully answer your questions. So we start here with a summary at Longwood Garden of what is the perfect lawn. Perfect lawn is really in the eye of the beholder. And at Longwood Gardens, they tend to look at the garden as not necessarily needing a perfect lawn. They choose cultural methods that reduce the use of herbicides. And so they may have a weed or two, but they have good turf coverage. And their philosophy is to work with nature and not against it. And that's the basis of our 12 steps, is to use cultural practices that will help you have better turf by working with the turf instead of fighting it. There are lots of benefits of good lawns. They look good, they have a cooling effect. Turfgrass also will trap an estimated 12 tons of dust and dirt annually. Healthy lawns will also absorb rainfall 6 times more effectively than a wheat field and 4 times better than a hay field. 90% of the weight of the grass plant is in its roots, which is important for stabilizing soil and preventing erosion. In a 50 by 50 area of healthy turf, the carbon dioxide, ozone, and sulfur and other gases that are absorbed releases enough oxygen for a family of 4. A quick note about stormwater management ponds. A lot of HOAs have stormwater management ponds, and a lot of people buy them or buy near them because of the view of the lake. It's important to understand that they're not lakes. They are stormwater management ponds, and what you do affects what the pond's going to look like. Proper turf maintenance will help reduce nutrients and sediments going into the pond, and it helps keep the lake look clean and look more like a natural pond or a natural lake than a gross stormwater pond with algae and all sorts of things. And even if you don't live right next to the pond, understand that your stormwater is going to be directed to it. So what you do in the neighborhood is going to affect what the neighborhood ponds look like. So first, a little bit about soils. Soils in Prince William County are great, unfortunately not for lawns. They're basically built for hardwood forests. We've got good clay loams, we've got good aeration, good iron content, they're fungal dominant, and they're generally acidic. And this is great if you're growing a hardwood forest, but it's not so good for lawns and gardens. In addition, in our suburban lots, we have a lot of compaction. Some of it is from use, some of it is from the way the land was developed and the house was put on. And what we end up with insufficient pore space, where there's not enough air, there's not enough water, there's not enough room for roots to grow. And we have a micro population that is greatly diminished. Another thing to think about is that trees, shade, and lawns don't necessarily go together. Trees tend to be really tough on turfgrass, and turfgrass needs at least 6 hours of direct sun. When you've got 4 to 6 hours, you've got a minimal chance for success, and you really should consider alternatives like ground covers and moss. If we look at alternative ground covers, there are many choices. You basically want to choose a species that's not going to die back to the ground in the wintertime. That will help hold the soil in the winter. There are some pluses and minuses. The big thing is that, ground covers really aren't available as seed for a lot of them. And so that means if you're converting in a larger area, it's going to cost more because you're going to have to start with plugs or plant starts. They tend to have poor tolerance to foot traffic and play. So if you've got kids, if you've got big dogs, they're not going to hold up very well against those. A lot of our lawn chemicals aren't safe for ground covers. And there's some HOAs that aren't going to allow those ground covers, especially in the front yard. On the other side, once established, they require pretty little maintenance. Most are fertilized at planting, if they're fertilized at all, or if there's some kind of nutrient deficiency that shows up. Generally speaking, though, we really don't fertilize ground covers. And some ground covers, if you fertilize them, you're actually contributing to their death. There are lots of species options, some that do well in the sun, some that do well in the shade, some that do well in both. You can add a lot of texture and color to your landscape using ground covers. And many of these ground covers are important nectar sources for pollinators. This is a list of several ground covers. Moss, there are 12,000 species of. Ground ivy, which is considered a weed in turf, actually makes an excellent ground cover. Bugleweed or juga can be a little bit invasive, especially in shady situations. Yarrow, there are native yarrows that work, as well as cultivars, hellebores, liriope, various thymes, various euphorbias, Pennsylvania sedge, meadow plants, cranesbill geranium, bluewood aster, golden groundsel, and bluewood aster and golden groundsel are especially important native now because they're showing promise in outcompeting Japanese stiltgrass, an invasive weed we have here in Virginia. If you have perennials that die back to the ground, like hostas or bleeding heart / squirrel corn, you want to use those in mulch beds so that mulch can help protect the soil when the plants have died back to the ground. And it's important to keep in mind that sometimes there is no right place for a plant based on what's going on. If you have heavy shade and you've got a lot of use to it, there aren't a whole lot of plants that can handle that. And you may have to think about permeable landscapes instead of having plants. And if you are going to have hardscapes, you want to think about using things that are impermeable, that is, they will let water go through them, as opposed to impermeable things like concrete, where the water will just run off. So let's get into the meat of things. We're starting off with the turf care calendar. Turf care is all about timing. We want to work with nature and we want to do the things that the plants want to do on their own. We want to take advantage of that. And so we're going to look at plant calendars based on what type of grass you have, warm season or cool season. We're going to use our pest management guide to determine when the correct timing for pesticides, whether they be insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. Now, the maintenance schedule differs greatly from cool season and warm season grasses, and so you need to know what you have. If your lawn looks like this in the winter, you have a warm season grass. Most of us in Northern Virginia have cool season grass. Cool season grasses are fescues, bluegrasses, and ryegrasses. For the most part, our lawns in Northern Virginia are either fescue or fescue bluegrass mix. They tend to grow when it's cooler. They have little to no winter dormancy. A lot of times they may not have a lot of top growth in the winter, but they're growing roots. They have a continuously active root system. Their tolerance of the summer varies on a lot of things. Species, it varies by cultivar, varies by condition. And you get a wide variety of shade tolerance, from the fine fescues, which are most shade tolerant, to Kentucky bluegrass, which is pretty poor. Tall fescue, the main turf grass here in Northern Virginia, is a bunch grass, which means it grows in clumps. It's slower spreading. It spreads by seed, but a lot of times with our lawns, we don't allow our grass to go to seed, so then it has to spread by tillers, which are daughter plants. It's more shade tolerant than bluegrass. Its roots are longer, so once it's established, it tends to be more drought tolerant than bluegrass. And it usually germinates 1 to 2 weeks. Kentucky bluegrass, on the other hand, spreads by rhizomes or underground stems. It really needs full sun. It has a relatively shallow root system. Its germination time is 3 to 4 weeks. And so those are considerations to think about when you're thinking about what kind of grass you want. If you compare the texture of our cool season grasses, Kentucky bluegrass is here on the left. It has a boat tip to it. Relative to that, we've got fine fescue, which are most shade tolerant, but also our thinnest bladed grasses. And so sometimes when we blend fine fescue with other grasses, they look a little bit out of place. Then we have tall fescue, again, our standard here in Northern Virginia, either by itself or with Kentucky bluegrass. And then we have K31, which is a type of tall fescue, but it's a very broad tall fescue. And sometimes people will buy K31 seed to overseed their lawn because it's inexpensive. And if you take K31 and you plant it into a tall fescue lawn that has more advanced genetics, it's going to look like a weed. So it's something to think about. And then finally, we've got perennial ryegrass. Now, if we think about how our cool season grasses grow, we basically have two pretty active growth windows. One is in early spring, and the other is in fall. And it's in fall when we want to do most of our maintenance. And a lot of what we do in the fall prepares the grass to be healthy, not only in the following spring, but the following summer as well. And so this is turf care calendar based on cool season grass. You can see a lot of maintenance things are over in the fall, particularly our September, October, November timeframe. Depending on the type of weed, depends on when we want to effectively treat it. Insect control, well, we want to do it when they're active, and we'll talk about insects and disease in a little bit, but generally speaking, we're not going to be doing a whole lot of that. It's mostly going to be weed control. Warm season grasses are things like Bermuda grass, zoysia, and nimblewill. Now, Bermuda grass, which is also known as wiregrass, and nimblewill are also considered weeds in cool season grasses. They love warm temperatures. They have very efficient ways of using water and light, so they don't need quite as much fertilizer. They're relatively low maintenance. In our area, we have almost no insect disease pressure. They do have winter dormancy, and the problem that a lot of people have is that too much dormancy occurs through most of the year, and in the spring, once the soil temperatures hit about 55 degrees, that's when green up starts, depending on what species we're looking at. Shade tolerance, nimblewill is actually our best for shade. Zoysia is kind of average, and Bermuda is pretty bad for shade. If you look at this graph, you can see that we have really one big growth window, and it's in the summer to early fall. And this is basically the opposite of when our cool season grasses. So it's really important to know which kind of grass you have and to manage it based on whether it's warm or cool season. Warm season calendar. One of the big concerns about having warm season lawns is that they tend to have that long winter dormancy. Zoysia has the longest, and you end up with a yard like this for a lot of the calendar. And so, you know, there are HOAs that don't allow warm season grasses, and there are some that do, and the ones that do, a lot of people look at that and it's like, no, I don't want that. However, there is a way around that. In a lot of places in Central Virginia, they're actually getting athletic field paint and basically dyeing the lawn once it goes into winter dormancy so it looks green. And then in the spring, when it comes out of that dormancy, the first cutting will remove all that dyed grass. It doesn't hurt the grass because it's designed to be used on athletic fields. Some turf companions you might think about, white clover. White clover has been vilified by the herbicide and golf industries as being bad. It takes away from that beautiful carpet of grass, but it traditionally has been part of the lawn. And if you look at how grasses and clovers evolve, they evolve together. There are pluses and minuses, as with all plants. White clover is pretty shade tolerant. A big thing is it actually adds nitrogen to the soil, so you don't need to apply as much fertilizer. The diversity of having different plant species helps the diversity of the beneficial microbes in the soil. And so having a mix of species is helpful. Downside, it's kind of hard sometimes to get even distribution when you're overseeding clover into your lawn. But another good positive is that it's more or less the same height as most turf, and so we can manage it and mow it at the same height. Typically, when we want to overseed clover, we want to have the grass established and then overseed clover into it. One type of clover you may have heard about is microclover. You see it a lot in eco-turf mixes. It's a pretty pricey clover. It's not quite as shade tolerant as white clover. It's not as competitive as white clover, but it blends in with turf really well. We're still working on what the best management practices are for micro clover, but the advantage of micro clover is this. If you look at those two fields, you can't really tell the difference between micro clover and fescue versus all fescue unless you're actually standing on it and looking straight down. That's when you can see the clover. That's when you have this picture here. This picture was taken on this field on the left. And that's one of the reasons why people like it. They still have that carpet look, but they still have the diversity. Again, it's kind of expensive, but it's an option to think about. The second thing we're going to take a look at is soil testing. Now, why do we want to soil test? Well, soil tests are going to tell us the conditions of our yard. They're going to tell us what we need to add to our lawn. So we recommend soil testing and pH adjusting about every 3 years. Unless you have sandy soil, then every 2 years is probably good. Sampling, you want the soil to be moist but not soggy. You want to avoid the unusual spots, the high spots, the low spots, because you're trying to get something that's an average of the lawn. And so if you start going at those weird spots, it's going to skew the results. If you have a problem area, you want to test that separately. And you definitely don't want to test where your pet is using as a bathroom. It's important, though, that you measure your lawn area so you can compute your fertilizer needs to match them up with your soil test results. Now, you can use a soil probe like this, or you can use a simple garden trowel. You want the top 4 inches of soil. You want to take multiple soil samples and then mix them in a clean bucket. Again, you're trying to get a cross section of the lawn so that you can apply things generally to the lawn. Typically, depending on who you're sampling with, 1 to 2 cups of soil is sufficient. So once you've taken all those sub-samples, you mix them together and you put them in a box or a bag or whatever the soil lab is requesting. The picture on the right shows Virginia Tech's soil test kit. It's a small box. It takes about a cup of soil. As far as soil test options go, Virginia Tech's soil test lab does samples for $10. Most of the commercial samples or commercial labs do samples for about $10 as well, sometimes more depending on what you're sampling for. And there are more options typically with commercial labs. We also have the Best Lawn program, which includes a master gardener going out and doing the sampling for you, measuring the lawn for you, and getting you back an individualized nutrient management plan. It's a little more pricey. It's one sample for $40, and then if we have to do multiple samples for any reason, it's $15 additionally. But the product is a lot more individual and a lot more user-friendly. So this is a typical lab result from Virginia Tech, and it's similar to what you get from a commercial lab as well. The reason why you want to go through a lab, whether it's Tech's or anybody else's, is because a soil lab is going to give you specific lime recommendations. Now you can take a pH meter and assuming that it's calibrated and it's a good meter, and you can get a soil pH, but it doesn't tell you how much lime you need to add if you need to add lime. A lab will do that because they do what's called a buffer index. And based on the buffer index, that tells you how much lime to add. And typically when we're talking about turf, lime and fertilizer recommendations are going to be in units per 1,000 square feet. So we've gotten our soil test, and now we need to amend the soil and adjust the pH. And we can do lime any time of the year as long as the ground is not frozen. So let's think about soil for a minute. Soil is a mix of minerals, organic matter, air, and water, which may support plant life. And so in an ideal world, this is the breakdown that we want. We want about half of our soil to be pore space. We want about half of it to be mineral with a little bit of organic matter. pH is critical. The #1 way to improve your soil is to correct the pH. If the pH is wrong, your nutrients are going to be locked up. So just pH, if you don't remember from school chemistry, measures the hydrogen ion activity in the soil. It's broken into 14 sections. It's a log scale. So 7 is 10 times more basic than 6.9. And ideally, we want something that's in between about 6 and 7. Here we have a table that shows nutrient availability. For most of our grasses, we want 6.2 to 6.8. That's when most of the nutrients they need are going to be most available. Unfortunately, our native soils are then great for trees, great for hydrangeas, but not so good for our turf grasses. We want that in that blue column between 6.2 and 6.8. So when we have an incorrect pH, basically what's going on is add our fertilizer. Usually the weeds get most of that fertilizer, very little goes to our grass, and the excess runs off. When we have the correct pH, we have fertilizer. Most of it is going to go to the grass. Some of it's going to the weeds, but there shouldn't be any excess fertilizer if we've applied the right amount of fertilizer. So if we think about raising the pH, again, we want to have it based on soil test results from a lab. Now, generally, you can use agricultural lime or ground limestone or calcium carbonate. It's all the same thing. And it usually comes in a pellet form or as a powder. The pellets are a little more expensive, maybe a few cents more a pound, but they're a lot easier to deal with. Sometimes dolomitic lime is recommended. Dolomitic lime can substitute for ag lime, but dolomitic lime has more magnesium in it. And so sometimes if your magnesium is out of balance with your calcium, the lab will recommend that. Wood ash, potash, they can be used, but they give variable results. It's really hard to accurately change the pH with those, so you don't want to use those. Gypsum is another product that gets sold a lot as a soil conditioner. It has calcium, but it doesn't actually raise the pH. It also does not enhance the structure of heavy clay soils. A lot of time it's sold as a clay breaker. Its effects are not really what you would expect from a clay breaker. It has some agricultural use, but in a home lawn situation, it's not very useful at all. Also keep in mind that too much lime can be harmful. If you drive the pH up into the 8s, and I've seen that happen when people lime every year, you can run into some problems with your plants as well. One thing that you really want to think about, especially in our urban compacted soils and our suburban compacted soils, is adding organic matter. Organic matter is the fuel that drives nutrient cycling. Microbes use this organic matter as their food, and their waste products help break down nutrients and cycle nutrients. So we want to add organic matter ideally annually, if not more often. It's going to increase microbial activity. It's going to help resist compaction. It's going to improve soil structure, and it's going to help retain moisture and nutrients. Now you can top dress an established lawn annually or semi-annually with 1/4 inch of compost, or if you're starting a new lawn, you want to till 1 to 2 inches of compost when you're doing that before you start your planting. Remember, healthy microbes equal a healthy lawn. This is the second best way to improve your soil. Let's talk mowing. Mowing, depending on what kind of grass you have, depends on when you're going to be doing it. Typically in the summertime, as cool season grasses go into their summer dormancy, you don't mow them as much. Spring and fall, you don't mow warm season grasses very much. One of the things that people run into as a problem is mowing height. Mowing height is really important because the right height gives you deeper, stronger roots, which also means healthier grass. The right height also allows fewer weeds to invade the lawn. And the reason for that is that a lot of weed seeds need sunlight to germinate, or they need sunlight for their seedlings to break through and establish. And if you have your turf at the right height, you've got dense canopy cover that's going to block that sunlight, and it's going to not allow those weeds to take hold, or allow very few weeds to take hold. So generally speaking, if we're looking at Bermuda or Zoysia or Nimblewheel, we want it about 1 inch. But for our bunch grasses, Kentucky bluegrass, creeping red fescue, perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, we want to keep it a lot higher. With tall fescue and tall fescue-based lawns, we're talking about 3 to 4 inches. Ideally, the higher the better. Typically, we don't see all Kentucky bluegrass or all perennial ryegrass lawns in this area. Occasionally, you'll see a creeping red fescue. If you're going to cut it like a turf, you want to keep it about 3.5 inches. If you're going to let it grow naturally, you can let it grow to its maximum height. When we mow, we ideally don't want to move. When we mow, we ideally don't want to remove more than 1/3 of the blade with each mowing. This prevents excess stress, and this prevents having to steal energy from the root reserves in order to recover from it. While not always practical, where practical, we want to alternate our direction of mowing. This promotes a cleaner cut and more even cut. It's especially important when you're we talk about mowing direction. While not always practical, where it is practical, alternating the direction of mowing is helpful because it promotes an even cut. Ideally, you want to go at a right angle to the previous mowing. It also reduces compaction because you don't get ruts from where you keep putting the mower the same way every time. One of the things you can do with mowing to help your fertilizer bill is leave the clippings. One season's clipping can provide nutrients equal to 1/2 to a full pound of nitrogen. This also reduces the amount of yard waste that goes into the landfill, yard waste that goes into municipal facilities. Cool season lawn clippings do not cause thatch when you're properly mowing them. Dead stems and dead crowns are what cause thatch. And typically that's a result of over-fertilization, not lawn clippings. Clippings are basically 90% water and they break down pretty quickly. Follow the mowing height and frequency guidelines and you should be okay. During extended wet periods where the grass gets out of control, when you do cut, try and double cut. Cut as high as possible, then wait till the clippings dry and mow again at the desired height. It's also important to keep your mower up and running at an optimum condition. Service your mower depending on how much you use it. Make sure to change the oil, replace the air filter, replace the spark plug, and sharpen the blade after 10 hours of use. The grass you see here, all that wispy stuff is from being mowed by a blade that wasn't sharp. A dull blade tears and rips at the grass blades. A clean cut comes from a sharpened blade. It's important that we have a nice, crisp, sharp cut because that reduces the amount of surface area that disease can enter the plant. Next, let's talk watering. Watering is something you may or may not choose to do, depending on your situation and depending on the type of grass you have. The big thing with watering is you're either going to do it or you're not going to do it. Generally, spring rains provide adequate irrigation of lawns. Once the summer starts, that's when a lot of people start watering their grass. And this is one of those things that if that's what you choose to do, you should continue all summer. Inconsistent watering is going to weaken the plant by overstressing it. If you choose to water, you want to apply 1 inch of water per week in the summer to cool season grasses. Ideally, you want to apply that 1 inch one time a week. If your soil cannot infiltrate that much water at one time, you want to do a ½ an inch every 3 to 4 days. Keep in mind that 1 inch of water per 1,000 square feet is approximately 625 gallons. That can get pricey over there. So if you choose the water, you want to with cool season grasses, you want to If you choose to water with cool season grasses, you want to water 1 inch per week per 1,000 square feet in the summer. Once a week is the ideal way, where it's one big watering. Some soil can't absorb that much water at one time without running off. In that case, what you'd want to do is every 3 to 4 days, you'd want to apply a ½ an inch of water. Now, keep in mind that when there are storms, you wouldn't water because they will provide enough irrigation. Also keep in mind that 1 inch of water is approximately 625 gallons for 1,000 square feet of turf. Most of our home lawns are somewhere between 5 and 7,000 square feet. That gets pricey in the long run, so it's a consideration. We want that watering to be deep and infrequent, and that's why ideally we're going to apply that water once a week. And that's going to help with deep grass roots. It's going to curb weed development. Now, when you water, you ideally want to water early in the morning. We're talking 6 to 10 a.m. Some of the reasons you might not want to water. If you have warm season turf, once it's established, it almost never needs it. It's designed to live through summer drought. With cool season grasses, they're designed to go dormant in the summer. And while they may have some damage in the summer, they typically recover in the fall. Water is pricey. Again, 625 gallons per 1,000 square feet per week. That adds up. You can let your grass grow dormant. It's okay. It may not look as nice, but again, it should recover in the fall. Let's talk weeds. Weed control is what we get a lot of calls about. And weed control is one of those things that it's really important to know what weed that you're using. Weed control is one of those things that we get a lot of calls about. And it's one of those things where you have to know what weed you're dealing with to know what product is going to work and what time you should be applying that product to make it product most effective. With weed control, we want to practice integrated pest management. And what that means is we want to be able to identify the weed, determine if it's a problem. Clover, some people think is a weed, but it does provide nitrogen and it does feed pollinators. There's a difference between having a couple weeds in the yard and being overrun with weeds. So if it's not really a problem, there's not really a reason to treat it. Then we want to think about, if we do need to deal with it, let's use the control of least harm. And that might be hand pulling, it might be pulling out a chemical, it just depends. We also want to think about when's the best time to control. Again, knowing what that weed is, knowing what products are available, we can figure out what the best time to apply those herbicides are so they will be most effective. With weed identification, you can bring samples into the Cooperative Extension Office when the office is open. Here in the land of COVID, that is not currently happening, but you can send pictures of weeds to our Master Gardener helpline. That's mastergardener@pwcgov.org. And we can identify weeds and give you control recommendations. You can also look up weeds on the University of Maryland Extension weed site or the North Carolina Extension weed site. they're a lot easier if you don't know your plants very well. They're a lot easier to figure out which weed is which. One of the things that we can do to eliminate weeds is use cultural controls, and that's things like mowing high, keeping the lawn healthy, and when in doubt, pull it out. And so here we have fine fescue that's cut a little bit too short, and so the main grass there is crabgrass, and you can see there's some crabgrass in the background growing too, because this grass is too short. If we mow that high, that crabgrass doesn't get that big and it doesn't get that aggressive. In the very foreground, you can see there's a little bit of Bermuda grass starting too. If we have to use chemical controls, we need to think about what type of herbicide to use. So there are two types. There's pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides. Pre-emergent herbicides basically stop plants from germinating, and most of our pre-emergents are designed to work on weed grasses. There may be 80% effective under ideal conditions, but depending on the conditions, they may not be that effective. They may also need to be reapplied throughout the summer for full control. And they can interfere with turfgrass seeding as well, so you have to be careful of when you use them and how you use them. With post-emergent herbicides, they work on weeds that have already sprouted, and their effectiveness varies by weed, chemical formula, and the timing of the application. If we talk synthetic herbicides, it's important to remember to give the herbicide a chance to work before you go back and reapply it. The label's going to have a lot of information, and it's important that you read this information. The label is the law, so you have to follow the label instructions to use the pesticide correctly. The label will specify a minimum wait period before reapplication. Keep in mind that a lot of the kills within 24-hour claims are under ideal conditions with young plants and will probably take longer with more mature plants. You really need to allow those herbicides to translocate throughout the entire plant and kill that. You also want to be aware that extended control formulas sometimes are going to be longer lasting than you think they are, and they may interfere with your plans for overseeding. Again, always read and follow pesticide labels. We do have some organic options. Again, you want to give them a chance to work. Most of our organic options are non-selective, which means anything they contact, they'll harm. They tend to be more effective on annuals than perennials because they tend to burn down, which means that they're going to kill the top part of the plant, but not necessarily the roots. And again, even though they're organic, it doesn't necessarily mean they're safer than synthetic herbicides. So read and follow the label. Now let's talk about insect and disease control. Again, we want to go with that integrated pest management. We want to identify the pests, control early, use the control of least harm. Insects are not a whole lot of a problem in Northern Virginia. Disease pressure is pretty high in Virginia, but our control options are limited. On the flip side too, most of the diseases that we get in Virginia are more cosmetic than actually going to kill the grass plant. So one of the most common turf problems that we have in Northern Virginia, especially when we see hot, humid weather, is brown patch. Brown patch loves tall fescue. Brown patch will usually not kill the turf. It usually only affects the upper part of the plant. The leaves are damaged, but the crowns stay intact. And so in time, it'll grow out of it. When we think about how do we control disease, the first thing we want to do is fertilize correctly. Over-fertilization and fertilization at the wrong time of year are going to increase a lot of our problems with disease. Another option is to live with it and hope the grass recovers in time. And a lot of times it's just waiting for the weather to change and that grass will start to recover. A lot of our disease pressure is over the summer. when the grass is dormant anyway. And so in the fall, when the grass comes out of dormancy, a lot of times it will just rebound. When we think about applying fungicides, we can apply synthetic fungicides. However, they often do more harm than good because they'll also kill beneficial fungus in the soil. We do have some organic fungicides, but they haven't proven effective in controlling diseases in turf. And so we don't recommend using them. Moving on to insects. With insects, we want to think about what the actual insect is and make sure that the insect is the problem, because some damage will look like insect damage, but really be disease damage. So we want to identify the insect, and then we want to verify that there are significant populations to warrant control. Now, our number one insect problem are white grubs, and you can see from the pictures, the top picture, the turf has been pulled back, and you can see a couple white grubs there. Typically, when we have 10 or more per square foot, that's a problem and we want to treat. So in the top picture, we've got maybe 4 per square foot. Not really a problem. A lot of times natural processes will take care of that, and they're not going to do significant damage. The picture on the bottom, if you look really closely, all those little white specks in there are grubs. That turf is heavily infested with white grubs and probably needs to be treated. Grubs are our number one insect. We ideally want to scout for them in June and August. Why not in July? Because typically in July they're adults and they're not in the soil. June and August is when they are close to the top level of soil. We want to treat in August because that's when they're young, close to the top of the soil, and most vulnerable to our insecticides. Our second most common insect are webworms. We want to scout for them in the summer. They're usually seen in the morning. Typically, if we have the turf mowed high, and we're talking with cool season grasses, 3 inches or more, you're not going to see webworms as a problem. And also, if we don't have a thatch layer that's pretty thick, we're not going to see webworms. So cultural controls for insects: manage your health in the turf. If you irrigate, water deeply and infrequently. You don't want to water every day because that's going to keep a nice moist layer in the upper layer of the soil, and those insects are going to thrive in that. You want to mow high, and you don't want to over fertilize. When thatch levels get greater than 1/2 inch, you want to dethatch. And again, thatch is usually not a problem in most of our lawns in this area. Bermuda grass, bluegrass, zoysia are the most susceptible, but again, it's a matter of if you're fertilizing them appropriately, they don't get thatch. If we're going to dethatch, we want to do it in late spring and early summer for warm season grasses, and spring or early fall in cool season grasses. And the reason for that, when we dethatch, we're going to harm the plant. So we want to do it at the early part of the growth period so the plant has time to recover before it gets into dormancy. So thatch is a dead layer between the leaves and the soil line, and that's where disease and insects can hide and thrive. And that's why we don't want a big thatch layer. With regular aeration, a lot of times we can break up thatch before it becomes a problem. If we look at synthetic insect controls, it's important to target the species when they are vulnerable. So again, with white grubs, which is our number one problem, we want to do that in August. And we want to consider the pesticide. Is it worth it? Do we have a big enough problem that warrants using it? And we want to think about, well, what can we use instead of applying insecticide? Keep in mind that these insecticides, yes, they're going to kill the grubs, but they're also going to kill the immature stages of beneficial insects in the soil as well. So we want to be cautious in using our pesticides. Next, let's look at aeration. Aeration allows us to open up the soil and get more air into the soil. Now, we typically want to do that early in the season because aeration, like dethatching, damages the plant, and we want to give it, the plant that is, time to recover before it goes into its dormancy periods. So this is tall fescue in late March. You can see those tan areas. That's a warm season grass weed, nimblewill. The nimblewill has not greened up. Generally, nimblewill will green up first, then Bermuda, then zoysia. So if you have a warm season lawn and the turf is still tan, it's too early to fertilize, it's too early to aerate. This being a mostly fescue lawn, however, this would be okay time to go ahead and aerate. Now, when we aerate, we want to use core aeration. That means they're going to take a plug of soil out. Spike aeration tends to compact the soil. Core aeration prior to fertilization and or overseeding of cool season grasses in the fall is usually beneficial. Adding compost after aeration is usually beneficial as well. So when you're corating, what you're doing is you're breaking up thatch, you're reducing surface compaction, you're opening up more channels deeper into the soil, you reduce puddling, you reduce runoff, you increase tolerance of heat, drought, and you, like I said, you take away some of that thatch, and so you don't often have to dethatch. Timing of fertilizer is critical. Applying fertilizer at the wrong time is not going to help your grass. There are certain fertilizer companies that will sell you programs when that say you should apply grass at X time. So when do we want to fertilize? If we've got warm season grass, we're talking about late spring through midsummer. So we want to wait until it's greened up, and we want to go midsummer. August 15th is the last day that we really want to fertilize warm season grasses in our area. So typically that window is June to mid-August. For cool season grasses, we want to do it in the fall. We follow what's referred to as the sun rule, September, October, November. You can fertilize cool season grasses in the spring, but you often will do more harm than good, especially if you're not judicious in the amount of fertilizer that you apply. If you over-fertilize in the spring, you're going to encourage diseases in the summer. So let's talk spring fertilization. There are some pluses and minuses. Obviously, fertilizer helps the plant grow, but think about what you're going to achieve. With cool season grasses, spring fertilization has some concerns. It will promote shoot growth over root growth, and root growth is important because roots are going to help the plant survive the summer. Also, when you spring fertilize, you have a higher risk of disease, especially brown patch. The other thing to consider is that annual weed germination occurs in the spring, and those weeds are going to benefit from that fertilization. So really, you're better off for cool season grasses fertilizing in the fall. If we think about fertilizer, think about nutrients. For the most part, we're applying three nutrients, three macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen helps the plant grow up, phosphorus helps the plant grow down, and potassium helps the plant all around. There are other things that we sometimes add, but for the most part, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the three that we're going to be adding. Nitrogen has some issues. If you apply too much of it in the wrong formula, especially, you're going to burn the plants. Nitrogen can be readily lost to the atmosphere, and it also moves readily through the soil. It's very water soluble, so it's going to run off. If you apply nitrogen before rain, for example, it's going to run off with stormwater runoff. But nitrogen is important for stimulating top growth. Phosphorus is important for stimulating root growth, and then later with blooming and fruiting. Generally speaking, it's not very water soluble, so it sticks to clay particles, which is good in terms of protecting our waterways from excessive nutrients. However, if you have a lot of bare spots, when that soil erodes, it's going to take phosphorus with it. And phosphorus is the limiting factor in waterways for algae. Potassium works to improve plant health. It helps with heat cold tolerance. It helps with disease tolerance. It helps with foot traffic tolerance. Potassium is susceptible to leaching in the soil. It is water soluble, but it's not considered a nutrient of concern. So if we look at a fertilizer bag, let's think about how to read that and why this is important. Now, this is an old fertilizer bag, and we know that because it's got phosphorus in it. In the 2010s, Virginia passed a law where unless you need phosphorus for turf, you're not supposed to apply a fertilizer with phosphorus to maintain the turf. And the way that you know that you need phosphorus is to have a soil test that shows that you need phosphorus. However, all of our bags are going to have three numbers, and that first number is the amount of nitrogen, the second number is the amount of phosphorus, and the last number is the amount of potassium. And these are percentages by weight. So 22% of that 42 pounds of fertilizer is going to be nitrogen, for example. Another thing you want to take notice of, a lot of them will say that they feed up to X number of square feet. That's really deceptive because it doesn't tell you what the rate of application is. And typically when we talk about rate of application, it's based on the amount of nitrogen we're putting down. So you need to think about the nitrogen and the application rate, not what the bag says. How much do we fertilize? With cool season turf, depends on the conditions. With sunny lawns, we want to apply up to 3 applications of no more than 0.7 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And we want to do this no more than 30 days or no less than 30 days apart. With shady lawns, we only want to do 2 applications because shady lawns don't have enough sunlight. Because they don't have as much sunlight, they don't grow as much, so they don't need as much fertilizer. How much is that? Well, to figure that out, we need to know the area of the turf. We need to know the percentage of nitrogen in the product that we're using, and we need to know the application rate that we're going to use. And so if we look at that fertilizer bag we just looked at, it's a 22,314. That 22% as a decimal is 0.22. And then our application rate, which is 0.7 pounds per 1,000 square feet. You've got those 2 numbers, but you really need to know the area of your turf to know how much to apply accurately. And applying the right amount of fertilizer at the right time is the 3rd best way to improve your soil. If we look at conventional fertilizer, or inorganic fertilizer, it's sometimes referred to, most of the nitrogen in it is ready to eat. It's ready to be consumed. It's in forms that plants can uptake immediately. And this can damage microbial life if it's applied in high enough dosage. It also discourages the symbiotic relationships between the microbes and the grass. If we apply organic fertilizer has to be converted to the nitrogen has to go from an organic state to an inorganic state for the grass to take it up. And it needs the microbes to do that. And so in an organic lawn, you're really feeding the microbes, not the plants. The microbes are converting what you're feeding them into a waste material that the plants can uptake. This helps foster symbiotic relationships between the two. It's said that up to a quarter of the carbohydrates produced by a plant in a healthy soil will go to the microbes. And the microbes in turn are providing nutrients. Some microbes are working to extend the root system to bring in nutrients from farther than the roots can reach, or to bring in water from the roots can reach. Some microbes will put up defense mechanisms against insects and against disease. It's a trade-off. Organic fertilizers take a little bit longer for the plants to get the nutrients, but there are also a lot of these side benefits. Now there's some free fertilizer options. If you're leaving your grass clippings on the lawn, you're recycling a half to maybe a pound of nitrogen over the course of the year. That's going to save you labor, and it's going to save you money at the Home Depot or the Lowe's or the garden center or wherever you buy your fertilizer. Another free fertilizer option is clover. If you have a lawn that's got 25% clover, you're recycling approximately another pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet a year. And you're supporting pollinators as well. Those are options that will help reduce your fertilizer costs. Let's talk about repairing damaged lawns. Sometimes when we think about repairing our lawns, we have to consider, are we going to do weed control or are we going to seed? Because a lot of our weed controls will interfere with our seeding or will force us to push back seeding to a time where it may not be convenient. We often talk about the windshield test, which means, does the lawn look good if you drive by the house? The lawn looks good, maybe you don't need to work on weed control. Maybe you want to reseed it if it doesn't look so good. Again, it's subjective, and quite honestly, perception plays a lot with homeowners, and it's what you're comfortable with. When we look at renovation options, with warm season grasses, we don't really have a whole lot of renovation options. They're spreading plants, and so the renovation is usually, give them a little extra fertilizer and they'll spread faster. With cool season, we can overseed. We can do a partial renovation, which is like spot treatments for bare spots. Or if the grass is in awful condition, we can just kill it all off and start over and do a full renovation. Which option is best for you? It really depends. When we look at turf, you need to consider what's going on. Is there heavy shade? Are the soils wet? Are there slopes? All those sorts of things to think about when you're thinking about repairing. So let's look at this lawn. We typically say there's a 50% rule, where if you've got 50% or more weeds, you're probably better off in the long run of killing everything off and starting over. We look at the picture here. This is at our demonstration garden, and the grass area on the right is the part that we manage. The grass area on the left is a part that we don't manage, that's mowed very short, and so you can see all the weeds that are there. And we have thick, dense grass, and we're following cultural practices that encourage healthy grass. Now, we do have some weeds, not very many, but we do have some weeds, but we're good with that. The other thing is, don't obsess about your grass. A carpet of beautiful uniform grass looks great. However, it's not the easiest to maintain. And in Virginia, we're in what's known as the transition zone. So we can grow lots of different types of grasses, but we can't grow any of them really well. If you're coming from a different area, I know folks from Minnesota, and they can grow beautiful cool season grasses, beautiful bluegrass lawns in Minnesota. We can't do that here. I know folks from Georgia who have beautiful zoysia lawns in Georgia, but we can't always do that here. Don't obsess about your grass. Decide what you can live with and aim for that. If we talk about overseeding, keep in mind that grass plants live 3 to 5 years. So overseeding can be beneficial, but you don't have to do it every year. Make sure you're buying quality grass seed. If possible, buy varieties that are listed in the Virginia Turfgrass Recommendations publication that's published each year by Virginia Cooperative Extension. As we talked about earlier, use Kentucky 31 tall fescue with caution. If your lawn has improved tall fescue varieties and you overseed with Kentucky 31, or K31 as it's sometimes referred to, when those grasses come up that next spring, they're going to look like weed grasses. So let's look at a seed tag. One of the things you want to look at is freshness. Grass seed germination rates fall off the older the grass seed is. And so we want seed that is less than a year old when we look at when it was germination tested. So if we follow the purple arrow, we can see that in 903 was when this was tested. So this is basically good until September of 2004. After that, germination percentage is going to fall off greatly. Then we want to look at the percentage of pure seed. Higher is always better. In this particular case, if we're following the blue arrow, over 99% of the bag, and again, this is by weight, is tall fescue. There's a little bit of what's referred to as other crop seed, and that typically is grass seed that they couldn't identify what variety it was. And then weed seed, ideally you shouldn't have any weed seed in it, but sometimes it's really hard to separate out weed seed. But you definitely want no noxious weed seed. Noxious weed seeds are the invasive stuff. If something has noxious weed seeds in it, walk away. I will say, and I can't think of a grass seed bag that I've seen in the last 10 years that's had noxious weed seeds. They're pretty good about that. Most of the seed that we get here is high enough quality where we're not going to have that problem. So the other thing that you want to take a look at is the germination percentage. The higher, the better. Now, this is a little bit deceptive because each place that tests germination has a set target that they're looking for. And once they reach that, they throw away the sample and move on to the next one. So in this particular case with this Stay Green product, it's all 80% germination. And more than likely what that means is 80% or higher, because 85% had germinated, and then they threw the sample away and went on to the next one because they're processing so many. And so it's 85% at least. We also want to look at the percentage of other ingredients. Now, in most cases, lower is better. However, in this particular product, if we look at those other ingredients, we have a nitrofuse coating. Now, a nitrofuse coating is their brand name for a coating that has nitrogen. So this is a product that is coated and has nitrogen with it. And so when we plant this, we don't have to apply nitrogen because there's already some there, but it's 50% of the bag. So this is a 7-pound bag for this tag. So only 3.5 pounds of that seed is actually seed. And so you need to keep that in mind when you're buying enough seed to overseed. And again, be aware of that nitrogen, because you've got basically 0.5 pound of nitrogen, if you do the math, per 1,000 square feet. How much should you seed? Well, it depends on whether you're trying to establish or if you're just overseeding. With tall fescue and tall fescue mixes, we basically say 6 to 8 pounds per 1,000 square feet if we're going to establish a new lawn or do bare spots, and then 3 to 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet if we're just overseeding. Measuring your lawn is important because most of the time recommendations for turf come in 1,000 square feet units. How much turf do you have? Do you really know that? It is not your lot size. I have dealt with clients who tell me that their turf area is a 1/4 acre and they're on a 1/4 acre lot. That can't happen because of the house, because of the driveway, because of foundation plantings, because of the trees, the flower beds. So you really need to know how much turf you have, because over fertilization is going to cost you money and it harms the environment. Also, there's some plants, if you're over fertilizing nearby some plants, you could be giving them fertilizer accidentally at the wrong time of year or over fertilizing them as well. And it's important to keep track of your lawn size as you add or reduce the amount of turf in your landscape. When you measure your lawn, you want to be as accurate as possible, but when in doubt, you want to try and underestimate the total turf area. That way, it will help ensure that you don't over fertilize. Some of the common tools that we use are handheld GPSs, measuring tapes, and measuring wheels. When you're doing this, you're going to want to try and break the lawn into simple geometric shapes that aren't going to be difficult to calculate. Rectangles, triangles, and circles. You're going to add up all the turf areas and subtract any non-turf areas from that to get a total area. When you're measuring your lawn, you want to break it into simple geometric shapes to calculate the total turf area. Things like rectangles, triangles, and circles, where the formulas are simple. Then you're going to add up all the turf areas and subtract out any non-turf areas. Like, for example, in this picture, we've broken it into squares and triangles. The circles there represent trees and shrubs that we're going to take out, so we're going to subtract those out. One of the advantages of using our Best Lawns program is that the master gardener is going to do all these calculations for you. Let's look at calibrating now. It's important to calibrate your spreader before each use. If your spreader is not calibrated, you don't know how much you're actually putting down, sometimes until it's too late. Don't rely on the product label. If the Scott's bag says for Scott's spreader use setting 3, A, it doesn't tell you what the application rate is, and B, that may have been true when that bag label was printed, but the particle size of the individual fertilizer pellets may have changed since then. So we don't want to rely on the product label. And I'm not picking on Scotts for this. This is true of any fertilizer that has a rating for a specific type of spreader. It's a place to start, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right setting. So it's important that you calibrate before you add lime or fertilizer or even some pesticides. And there are a lot of resources for you that will show you how to accurately calibrate, which are listed here. Understand too how your spreader works. You know, with drop spreaders, you're dropping in between the wheels. With broadcast spreaders, you're spreading out well beyond the wheels. And so you have a center track where most of the fertilizer goes, and you've got outer tracks where partial fertilizer goes. And so a lot of times when you're using a drop spreader, you are going in straight rows next to each other. If we look again back here, this guy is doing rows right next to each other because the spreader is in between the wheels. With a broadcast spreader, we have to overlap to make up for that outer area that doesn't get as much fertilizer. So let's try and put all this together. For cool season grass, we want to look at fall work days, and basically up to 3 work days. The first work day is when we do most of our work. And if we compare standard to organic, it's pretty similar. We're going to early September, aerate, fertilize, apply compost. If we need to overseed, we'll overseed. If we have lime that needs to be applied, we'll apply it then. Then in October, 30 days after the first workday, we apply fertilizer, we apply lime, and then 30 days after that, we apply fertilizer, we apply lime again if needed. Again, organic is very similar. The difference is you may apply compost a second time, and you probably are only going to do 2 fertilizer rounds. With warm season grasses, we're looking at an early June or late May kind of green up time, and we're going to be aerating, we're going to be fertilizing, we're going to be applying compost, and if needed, we're going to be applying lime. 30 days after that, so we're looking at late June to mid-July. We'll fertilize if desired, add lime if needed. On the organic side, instead of fertilizer, we're probably going to make a second compost application. So 3 things to do to have a better lawn. Adjust the soil acidity or pH so that it supports the turf grass. Regularly apply compost into your soil. Fertilize at the correct time, in the correct amount, and you'll promote healthy turf grass growth. The improved health of the lawn will take care of many of your weed and pest problems. For more information on lawn care, soil testing, fertilizers, etc., contact the Prince William County, Virginia Cooperative Extension Office at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Thank you for watching our program. If you enjoyed this program, please let us know with your questions, your comments, and suggestions for other classes. For more information on lawns and gardens, again, contact our Extension Horticulture Help Desk at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Also, check out our websites, Prince William County website for Virginia Cooperative Extension. If you enjoyed this program, please let us know with your questions, comments, and suggestions for other classes. For more information on lawns and gardens, again, contact the Horticulture Extension Help Desk at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Thanks for watching.